A single sheet of paper decided everything. For 9 years, it remained hidden, a silent witness tucked away behind the heavy, ornate headboard of a penthouse suite in the Heiress Grand Acapulco. By August 2023, the suite was a skeleton of its former self, stripped of its silk curtains and plush carpets, filled only with the ghosts of past luxury and the fine dust of demolition. A young maid, tasked with the final clean-out before the room was completely reimagined, saw it flutter to the floor, a small, folded note yellowed with age. It was an insignificant thing in a room once defined by grandeur, yet this forgotten whisper from the past was about to scream a truth that had been buried for nearly a decade. The discovery was an accident, a fluke of physics and timing. As two workmen grunted, heaving the ridiculously oversized mahogany headboard away from the wall, the folded paper was dislodged from its hiding place within the frame. It danced in the air for a moment, a pale moth in the sunbeams cutting through the dusty room, before settling near the maid's worn-out shoes. She almost swept it up with the rest of the debris, but a flicker of curiosity, or perhaps fate, made her pause. Bending down, she picked it up, her fingers tracing the delicate faded blue ink of a message that had been waiting patiently for the right person to find it. The paper felt brittle, fragile, as if it might disintegrate into nothing but secrets. While this quiet moment unfolded on the hotel's top floor, a far more brutal scene was playing out below. In the newly commissioned meditation garden, an oasis of pristine green lawns and exotic flowers, the tranquility was shattered. The manicured perfection was marred by crude yellow police tape and the grim, methodical work of an excavation team. The rhythmic scrape of shovels against soil was the only sound that dared to challenge the oppressive afternoon heat. This garden, meant to be a symbol of peace and renewal under the new Heiress leadership, was about to give up a secret it had been forced to keep, a dark truth concealed just beneath the surface of its carefully cultivated beauty. These two disparate events, separated by several floors of polished marble and reinforced concrete, were inextricably linked. The note found in the dust of the past was the key to the horror being unearthed in the present. For 9 long years, the disappearance of Isabella Heiress had been a carefully managed narrative, a tragedy spun into a tale of a flighty heiress who simply ran away from it all. The Heiress family, led by their charismatic and ruthless son Ricardo, had weathered the scandal, cementing their power and expanding their empire. The hotel itself, a jewel on the Acapulco coast, stood as a monument to their resilience, its sun-drenched facade hiding the rot within its foundations. The memory of that night was now a blur of champagne and confetti. December 31st, 2014. A lavish New Year's Eve party where the elite of Mexico came to celebrate. Fireworks painted the sky over the Pacific as 500 guests toasted to the future. Amidst the laughter and music, Isabella Heiress, the 21-year-old beloved daughter of the family patriarch, vanished. One moment she was there, a vibrant, smiling presence. The next, she was gone. The official story was that she had walked away from her privileged life, but the staff whispered a different tale. A ghost story of a girl who never left the building, her spirit forever trapped within the luxurious walls of her golden cage. Now, in the garden, the digging stopped. A heavy silence descended upon the excavation site, thick and suffocating. Detective Santiago Cruz, his face etched with the lines of a case that had haunted him for nearly a decade, moved to the edge of the shallow pit. He had been the original investigator, the one who suspected foul play, but was blocked at every turn by the Heiress family's immense influence and wealth. He was forced to close the file, but he never closed the case in his own mind. As he looked down, his expression was not one of shock, but of grim, soul-crushing validation. He had been right all along. The sight in the grave was a macabre tableau of decayed opulence. The tattered, earth-stained remnants of a once shimmering New Year's Eve gown clung to a delicate frame of bones. It was a heartbreaking image, the final, undignified resting place of a young woman who had the world at her feet. But it was a glint of gold that drew every eye, a flash of defiant light against the dark soil. There, on a single, slender phalanx of the skeleton's left hand, was a ring. It was her ring, a custom-made piece, unmistakable to anyone who knew her, shining as brightly as it had on the day she disappeared. A beacon of truth in a grave of lies. This was not just any piece of jewelry. It was a part of her identity, a gift from her father for her 15th birthday. The gold ring was Isabella's most cherished possession, a constant presence on her finger. Its discovery was the final, brutal punctuation mark on 9 years of calculated deception. Isabella Reyes had not run away to start a new life. She had been stolen from her own, her body discarded on the very property she was set to inherit. She was buried under a garden personally designed and commissioned by her brother, Ricardo, a serene memorial built directly on top of his most monstrous secret. And so, the story returns to the penthouse, to the young maid holding the fragile, time-worn note. That piece of paper, a final, desperate message cast into the future by a hand that had long since turned to dust, held the power to shatter an empire. It was Isabella's last will and testament, a map for the justice she had been denied. The note was proof that while bodies can be buried and secrets can be kept, the truth has a stubborn, persistent way of clawing its way back into the light. For the Reyes family, the long, peaceful summer was officially over. The young maid found Sofia Morales in her small, quiet garden, a world away from the gilded cage of the Reyes Grand Acapulco. For 9 years, Sofia had cultivated this peaceful existence, trading the scent of industrial cleaning solvents for the fragrance of jasmine and roses. Her hands, once accustomed to inspecting crisp linens and polished silver, were now perpetually dusted with soil. This quiet life was her penance, her self-imposed exile from a place that held too many ghosts. When the young girl, breathless and wide-eyed, extended a folded, yellowed piece of paper, Sofia felt the past rush back in with the force of a tidal wave. She had tried to forget, tried to move on, but the hotel had a long memory, and, it seemed, it was not yet finished with her. Sofia's fingers, wrinkled and marked by age, trembled as she accepted the note. The paper was brittle, almost weightless, yet it felt as heavy as a tombstone in her palm. She recognized the texture, the expensive stationery reserved for the penthouse suite, a detail no one else would ever notice. A cold dread, familiar and sickening, coiled in her stomach. For nearly a decade, she had forced herself to believe the official story, the tale of a flighty heiress who simply vanished. It was easier than confronting the alternative, a monstrous suspicion she had buried so deep she almost convinced herself it wasn't there. But as she held this forgotten whisper from the past, she knew the lie she had been living with was about to crumble into dust, just like the aging paper she held. With a deep, shaky breath, she carefully unfolded the note. The blue ink was faded, the handwriting delicate and slightly rushed, but it was unmistakably Isabella's. Her eyes scanned the few desperate words. "He's not who you think. My brother, the ring holds the proof. Don't let him have it all." Each word was a precise, surgical strike against the fragile piece Sofia had constructed. My brother. The 2 words confirmed everything she had feared, but never dared to say aloud. It wasn't a stranger, a kidnapper, or a tragic accident. The evil had been inside the house all along, smiling at them from across the dinner table. The note was not just a clue, it was an accusation, a final, desperate scream for help from beyond the grave. A torrent of memories flooded her mind, sharp and painful. She saw Isabella, barely a woman, her face alight with joy as she showed Sofia the custom-made gold ring, a 15th birthday gift from her adoring father. "It's my favorite thing in the whole world," the girl had said, her laughter echoing in the vast, empty penthouse. Sofia remembered the easy affection between Isabella and her father, and the subtle, almost invisible shadow of jealousy that would cross Ricardo's face during those moments. The note connected that shadow to an unimaginable darkness. The guilt was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. She had been there. She had seen the signs. Why hadn't she done more to protect the girl she loved like a daughter? A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she stumbled back to a small, wrought-iron bench. The world seemed to shrink, the vibrant colors of her garden fading to a dull gray. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. This small piece of paper was a ghost, the very essence of Isabella, reaching out across 9 years of suffocating silence. She clutched the note, her knuckles turning white, terrified that if she let go, the voice would fade forever, and Isabella would be lost for a second, final time. The promise was no longer implicit. It was a sacred pact. She was the keeper of Isabella's last words, the chosen recipient of a truth that had been patiently waiting for its moment to be revealed to the world. The grief that had been her constant, silent companion for 9 years began to transform. It crystallized, hardening from a dull ache into a sharp, cold resolve. The helplessness she had felt for so long evaporated, replaced by a steely determination. Isabella had not just left a clue, she had left an instruction. A final, desperate command. Sophia was no longer a retired housekeeper mourning a tragic loss. She was a witness, a messenger, the last guardian of a murdered girl's legacy. The Reyes family had used their immense power and wealth to bury the truth, but they had forgotten about the one thing money couldn't control, a mother's love, even for a child that was not her own. The time for quiet mourning was over. The time for justice had begun. Her thoughts turned to Ricardo. She pictured him as he was now, the powerful CEO, the celebrated visionary who had tripled the family's fortune. He was the picture of success, his handsome face gracing the covers of business magazines. But Sophia had seen another side of him, a cold, calculating emptiness in his eyes that he reserved for moments when he thought no one was watching. She remembered his dismissive tone when speaking of his sister's passions, the subtle cruelty disguised as brotherly teasing. The note was the key, the Rosetta Stone that translated all those small, unsettling moments into a coherent language of pure evil. He had not just inherited an empire, he had stolen it, building his throne atop his own sister's bones. Rising from the bench, Sophia walked with a newfound purpose into her small home. She went to an old cedar chest, a place where she kept the relics of her former life. Beneath a stack of neatly folded embroidered linens, she found a small, framed photograph of Isabella, taken on the hotel balcony just weeks before she disappeared. The setting sun had caught the gold in her hair, and her smile was genuine, full of the boundless optimism of youth. Looking at that bright, hopeful face, Sophia made a silent vow. "I hear you, mi niña," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I won't let him get away with it. I promise you, I won't let him have it all." The girl in the photograph seemed to smile back, her eyes full of trust. There was only one person in the world who might listen, one man who had shared her doubts before being silenced by the Reyes family's influence. Detective Santiago Cruz. He had been young back then, hungry and determined, but the system had broken him, forcing him to close a case he knew was a murder. Her hands, steady now, found an old, worn address book in a kitchen drawer. His name and number were still there, a faded entry from a chapter of her life she thought was closed forever. Making that call would be like striking a match in a room filled with gasoline. It would invite chaos and danger into her quiet life, but there was no other choice. Isabella deserved more than whispers and forgotten memories. She picked up the phone and dialed the number, the beep sounding unnaturally loud in the silent room. With each ring, she felt the weight of her decision. She was a retired housekeeper, a woman with no power or influence, about to challenge one of the most powerful families in Mexico. They had silenced police and press for 9 years. They would not hesitate to silence her. The fear was real, a cold knot in her stomach, but the image of Isabella's smile, of her final, desperate words, was stronger. This was not about her own safety anymore. It was about honoring a promise made to a ghost, a promise to drag a terrible secret out of the darkness and into the unforgiving light of day. A man's voice, rougher and more tired than she remembered, answered on the 4th ring. "Cruz." Sophia took a deep, steadying breath, the note in her other hand feeling like a sacred text. Her own voice, when she spoke, was clear and unwavering, imbued with a certainty that had been absent for nearly a decade. "Detective," she said, cutting through the static of the past. "This is Sofia Morales, from the Reyes Grand Acapulco. I'm calling about Isabella Reyes." She paused, letting the name hang in the air between them, heavy with unspoken history. You were right all those years ago. She never left. But this was just the beginning of what was to come. If you're already hooked on this mystery, please help our channel grow. Like this video, share it with someone who loves a good investigation, and subscribe, making sure to hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single clue as we unravel this story. What would you do in a situation like this? If you found a message from the past, a desperate plea for justice, would you have the courage to act on it, knowing the danger it could bring? Do you think you could bear the weight of such a terrible secret for 9 long years? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. To understand the tragedy that bloomed in the garden, we must go back 9 years, to a time when the Reyes Grand Acapulco was not a construction site but the undisputed king of the coast. In December 2014, it was a world of polished marble, hushed efficiency, and breathtaking ocean views from every suite. The air itself seemed different within its walls, scented with expensive perfume and the faint, clean smell of money. The Reyes family were not merely owners. They were modern royalty, and the hotel was their castle, a fortress of wealth and influence. The annual New Year's Eve gala was the pinnacle of their social calendar, a meticulously orchestrated display of power, where invitations were coveted like jewels, and the guest list was a who's who of Mexico's elite. It was a world built on the illusion of flawless perfection. At the heart of this gilded world was Isabella Reyes. At 21, she was more than just an heiress. She was the family's soul. While her brother Ricardo navigated boardrooms, Isabella explored the vibrant local art scene, her laughter echoing in dusty workshops far from the sterile luxury of the hotel. She possessed a warmth and genuine curiosity that charmed everyone from visiting dignitaries to the kitchen staff. But beneath the radiant smile, a sense of confinement was growing. She felt the weight of her name, the invisible bars of her golden cage. Her father saw her as the future, a leader with a heart, while Isabella dreamed of a simpler life, one where her worth wasn't measured by stock prices or hotel occupancy rates. This internal conflict made her both luminous and vulnerable. Her older brother, Ricardo, was the perfect counterpart, a man forged in the crucible of his father's ambition. To the outside world, he was the prodigal son, sharp, charismatic, and ruthlessly effective. He had a brilliant mind for business and a predator's instinct for weakness, qualities that had already doubled the family's holdings in the international market. He was the polished public face of the Reyes empire, always ready with a confident smile for the cameras. But those who worked closely with him, like Sofia Morales, saw something else in the quiet moments, a chilling emptiness in his eyes, a flicker of profound resentment whenever his father praised Isabella's compassion over his own cold, calculated success. He was a man who believed power was not just a birthright, but something to be seized and defended at any cost. The tension between the siblings was an open secret among the senior staff, a silent storm-gathering force within the penthouse walls. Their father, a patriarch from an older, more sentimental generation, openly favored Isabella. He admired her spirit and believed her connection to people was a greater asset than Ricardo's ruthless expansionism. He made it known that his impending new will would place the controlling interest of the entire Reyes hotel group in Isabella's hands, with Ricardo serving as her second-in-command. For Ricardo, this was not just a business decision. It was the ultimate betrayal, a public declaration that he, the son who had sacrificed everything for the empire, was worth less than the daughter who dreamed of escaping it. The decision lit a slow-burning fuse of narcissistic rage. Sofia Morales, then the meticulous head of housekeeping, saw it all. She had been with the family since before the children were born, and her affection for Isabella was deeply maternal. She was the one Isabella ran to after arguments with her father, the one who listened to her secret dreams of studying art in Paris. Sofia noticed the subtle shifts in the household atmosphere, Ricardo's increasingly dismissive tone towards his sister, the way he would watch her with an unnerving intensity when he thought no one was looking. She saw the fear that began to creep into Isabella's eyes in the final weeks of 2014. Sophia tried to dismiss her own growing unease as overprotective worry, but a part of her knew that the jealousy poisoning Ricardo was curdling into something far more dangerous and unpredictable. Unbeknownst to her family, Isabella had a secret world, a refuge from the suffocating expectations of her life. His name was Javi Garcia, a talented local artist who painted murals on the weathered walls of Acapulco's old town. They met at a small gallery, and their connection was immediate and profound. With Javi, Isabella was not an heiress. She was just a girl in love, free to be messy, passionate, and real. Their relationship was a clandestine affair, conducted in secret meetings on secluded beaches and in Javi's paint-splattered studio. She knew her family, especially Ricardo, would never approve. Javi represented everything they disdained. He had no money, no status, no power. He was an inconvenient truth in her perfectly curated life, and their love was a dangerous act of rebellion. In the week leading up to the New Year's Eve party, a palpable sense of dread had settled over Isabella. She confided in Javi that Ricardo's behavior had become more erratic, his veiled threats more frequent. He would corner her in the hallways of the penthouse, his voice low and menacing, reminding her of her duty and warning her against the stupidity of defying him. "He looks at me like he doesn't even see his sister anymore," she had told Javi, her voice trembling. It was during this time that she began to think of creating an insurance policy, a way to protect herself. The idea of recording their confrontations started as a desperate thought, a small shield against a brother she was beginning to genuinely fear. Her cherished gold ring, always on her finger, became her focus. And so, the stage was set for December 31st, 2014. The Heiress Grand Acapulco was a symphony of celebration. 500 guests, draped in designer clothes and glittering jewels, mingled on terraces overlooking the Pacific as fireworks prepared to ignite the midnight sky. Champagne flowed like water, and a live orchestra filled the air with music. But floors above the glamorous festivities, in the private sanctity of the family penthouse, a different drama was reaching its crescendo. The forced smiles and polite conversation could not mask the toxic current of greed and resentment that pulsed just beneath the surface. While the world outside prepared to toast to a new year, the Reyes family was about to be irrevocably fractured by an act of unimaginable darkness. The patriarch, Alejandro Reyes, was a man carved from a different era. He had built his empire not with algorithms and hostile takeovers, but with handshakes, intuition, and a genuine understanding of hospitality. He believed the soul of his business was not in its profit margins, but in its reputation, in the loyalty of its staff and the satisfaction of its guests. His decision to name Isabella as his successor was a testament to this philosophy. He saw in her the same warmth and empathy that he valued in himself, a quality he found disturbingly absent in his son. In his aging eyes, Ricardo's ruthless ambition was a liability, a cold flame that could expand the empire, but ultimately burn its heart out. Alejandro's health was failing, a fact he hid from the public but could not conceal from his family, lending a desperate urgency to the question of his legacy. He wanted to secure a future built on compassion, not conquest, and in his mind, only Isabella could deliver that promise. Ricardo, on the other hand, had perfected the art of the public facade. He was the darling of the financial press, a visionary who spoke eloquently about market disruption and brand synergy. His smile was a weapon, disarming competitors and charming investors with equal ease. But within the hotel, away from the cameras, this mask would occasionally slip. Sophia had seen it. She recalled an incident just weeks before the New Year's party when a junior concierge made a minor error with a VIP booking. Ricardo hadn't raised his voice. Instead, he had calmly and quietly dismantled the young man's confidence with a series of surgical, cruel remarks, leaving him visibly shaking. It was a terrifying display of controlled psychological violence, a glimpse into the profound emptiness that lay beneath the charismatic veneer. He was not just ambitious. He was a predator who enjoyed the fear of others, a man who saw people as pawns on his personal chessboard. In those final weeks, Isabella's radiant energy had begun to dim, replaced by a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety. The arguments with Ricardo became more frequent and more frightening. She confessed to Sophia that he no longer shouted. His threats were now delivered in a chillingly calm, almost conversational tone. He would corner her in the private library, his physical presence overwhelming, and speak of the family's future as if she were a temporary obstacle that needed to be managed or removed. It was after one such encounter that she began to seriously consider her insurance policy. The fear was no longer an abstract worry, it was a cold, hard certainty. Her brother, the man she had grown up with, was capable of anything to prevent her from taking what he believed was rightfully his. She felt utterly alone, trapped on the top floor of a castle that had become her prison. The gold ring became her talisman, a tangible link to a time before Ricardo's jealousy had curdled into something monstrous. It was a delicate custom piece her father had commissioned, with an intricate sunburst design, a detail Ricardo had always mocked as childish. This dismissiveness was exactly why she chose it. He would never look twice at it. The idea to hollow it out came from an article she read about historical spycraft, of messages hidden in plain sight. With Javi's help, they found a master jeweler in a back-alley workshop who, for a generous price and no questions asked, transformed the sentimental trinket into a tiny, functional locket, barely large enough for a micro-SD card. It was a desperate, clever act of self-preservation. The ring was no longer just a symbol of her father's love. It was now a potential vessel for the truth, her only shield against the darkness gathering around her. Her time with Javi was the only light in this encroaching shadow. His studio, a chaotic, vibrant space smelling of turpentine and oil paint, was her sanctuary. There, surrounded by his bold, colorful murals, she could shed the weight of being a Heiress. They would talk for hours, not about business or family obligations, but about art, music, and a future where they could be together, far from Acapulco. He saw the real Isabella, the passionate, slightly insecure artist who dreamed of getting her hands dirty with clay, not of signing billion-dollar contracts. He was fiercely protective of her, and her growing fear of Ricardo terrified him. He begged her to go to their father, to tell him everything, but she was paralyzed, afraid of breaking her father's already fragile heart with the monstrous truth about his own son. Their love was her escape, but it also complicated her ability to fight back. The tension within the penthouse suite was a palpable thing, a poison seeping into the very atmosphere of the hotel. The staff moved with a nervous, quiet efficiency, their professional smiles never quite reaching their eyes. They were experts at pretending not to see, not to hear. They had heard the muffled arguments, seen Isabella's tear-streaked face as she fled to her room, and witnessed Ricardo's cold, dismissive glares. They whispered in the service corridors and kitchens, speculating about the patriarch's will and the open hostility between the siblings. They knew something was terribly wrong. A sense of collective foreboding had settled over them, the feeling of watching a slow-motion tragedy unfold. But they were powerless, their livelihoods dependent on the very family that was imploding. Their silence was not agreement. It was a necessity for survival. A wall of complicity built brick by brick out of fear. As the day of the gala arrived, the hotel was a masterpiece of organized chaos. Trucks delivered mountains of fresh flowers, crates of vintage champagne, and pounds of exotic seafood. The grand ballroom was transformed into a celestial wonderland of silver and white, with thousands of tiny lights mimicking a starry night sky. The orchestra rehearsed on the main stage, their soaring melodies a stark contrast to the silent, brutal war being waged floors above. For the 500 guests preparing to attend, it was the party of the year, a night of glamour and celebration. For Isabella, it was a countdown. She moved through the day in a daze, overseeing last-minute details with a practiced smile while her mind raced, calculating her options, weighing her fears. The magnificent stage for the Reyes family's greatest triumph was also the perfect setting for its darkest secret. On the afternoon of December 31st, just hours before the first guests were scheduled to arrive, Ricardo found Isabella on the penthouse balcony, looking out at the calm Pacific. He approached her not as a brother, but as a conqueror. In his hand was a small, elegantly wrapped box. "A New Year's gift," he said, his voice smooth as silk. Inside was an antique silver locket, beautiful and ornate. "To replace that childish ring," he added, his eyes glinting with a meaning she understood instantly. It wasn't a gift. It was a final warning. A declaration. He knew she was hiding something, and he was telling her it was useless. Her hand instinctively closed around the gold ring on her finger. The warmth of the metal was a small comfort against the icy chill of his threat. As he walked away, she knew the night would not end with a champagne toast. It would end with a confrontation she could no longer avoid. Detective Santiago Cruz sat in his cluttered, dimly lit office, the receiver still pressed to his ear long after Sophia had hung up. For 9 years, the Isabella Reyes case file, a thin, pathetic collection of dead-end interviews and redacted financial statements, had sat on the corner of his desk like a tombstone. It was a monument to his biggest failure, a constant, nagging reminder of the day his ambition had collided with the impenetrable wall of Reyes family influence. He had been young, arrogant, and sure he could break the case. Instead, the case had broken him. Sophia's call was not just a new lead, it was a ghost from the past, offering a single, tantalizing chance at redemption. The weariness in his bones, a companion for nearly a decade, was suddenly replaced by the familiar, electric hum of the hunt. He pulled the dusty file towards him, its cover worn from years of frustrated contemplation. This time, he would not be stopped. He met Sophia at a small, unassuming cafe, miles from the tourist-choked coastline, a place where conversations could be buried under the clatter of ceramic mugs and the hiss of an espresso machine. She looked older, the lines of grief etched permanently around her eyes, but her hands were steady as she passed the folded note across the table. Cruz handled the paper with a reverence reserved for sacred artifacts. It was fragile, yellowed, and smelled faintly of dust and time. He read the words, his eyes tracing the delicate, faded blue ink. "He is not who you think, my brother. The ring holds the proof." The message was a dagger, precise and deadly, aimed directly at the heart of the official narrative. It was everything he had suspected but could never prove. A final, desperate whisper that had somehow survived 9 years of suffocating silence to find its way to him. The note was a Rosetta Stone for the entire cold case. "My brother." 2 words that recontextualized every polite denial, every condescending smile Ricardo Reyes had given him during the initial, fruitless interviews in 2015. Back then, Ricardo's alibi had been perfect. A seamless tapestry woven from the testimony of 100 powerful party guests. He was the grieving brother, a pillar of strength for his devastated family. This note painted him as the serpent in the garden. And the second part, "The ring holds the proof," transformed a piece of sentimental jewelry into the central clue of a homicide investigation. It gave Cruz a tangible target, a physical object that Isabella herself had designated as the key to her own murder. The case was no longer a ghost story whispered in the hotel's service corridors. It was now a treasure map, drawn by the victim herself. Acting on the note's implicit direction, Cruz re-examined the hotel's original blueprints against the plans for the recent renovations. It was Sophia who provided the emotional geography. She recalled how Isabella had a favorite spot on the grounds, a secluded alcove of bougainvillea, where she would go to read and escape the pressures of her life. That exact location, once a wild, overgrown corner of the estate, was now the centerpiece of the new meditation garden, a project personally designed and fast-tracked by Ricardo. The coincidence was too chilling to ignore. It was a monstrous act of hubris, a killer building a monument to tranquility directly on top of his most violent secret. With Sophia's tearful testimony providing the probable cause, Cruz secured the warrant he had been denied 9 years prior. The excavation began within hours, the shovels breaking ground on Ricardo's perfectly manicured lie. The scene in the garden was a brutal collision of past and present. Under the harsh glare of portable floodlights, the forensic team worked with grim precision, their quiet, methodical movements a stark contrast to the horror they were unearthing. As the last layer of soil was brushed away, a collective, sharp intake of breath seemed to hang in the humid night air. It was her. The skeletal remains were tangled in the rotted, mud-stained tatters of what had once been a magnificent designer gown. Cruz stood at the edge of the shallow grave, the acrid smell of disturbed earth filling his lungs. This was the grim validation he had both sought and dreaded. Isabella Reyes had not run away. She had been discarded like a piece of trash on the very land she was supposed to inherit, her final resting place, a macabre secret garden. The glint of gold was unmistakable, even in the dirt. A forensic specialist, using delicate brushes and tweezers, carefully worked to free the ring from the slender phalanx of the skeleton's left hand. As it was lifted into the light, a hushed silence fell over the team. Even caked in 9 years of soil, the intricate sunburst design was clearly visible. It was a perfect match for the detailed photographs in the original missing person file, the custom-made piece Alejandro Reyes had commissioned for his daughter's 15th birthday. The object was placed in an evidence bag, its journey from a symbol of a father's love to a key piece of murder evidence now complete. The emotional weight of the small golden circle was immense. It was the last thing Isabella had touched, her final defiant connection to a world that had so utterly failed to protect her. Back in the sterile environment of the mobile forensics lab, the ring was carefully cleaned. Under the bright, unforgiving light of a magnifying lamp, the technician made the first critical discovery. "Detective, you need to see this," she said, her voice tight with excitement. She pointed to a hairline seam running along the inside of the band, a detail so perfectly integrated into the design it was practically invisible. It wasn't a solid band of gold. It was a container. A tiny, masterfully crafted locket. The words from the note echoed in Cruz's mind. "The ring holds the proof." Isabella hadn't been speaking metaphorically. She had literally hidden the evidence on her own finger, in a place so intimate and personal that no one, especially not her dismissive brother, would ever have thought to look. The ingenuity of it was breathtaking, a final, clever move from a brilliant young woman fighting for her life. Cruz felt a surge of adrenaline so potent it made his hands shake. He left the chaotic scene at the hotel and immediately called Sophia. He kept his voice level, professional, but the news he delivered was a seismic shock. "Sophia, it's a locket. The ring is a locket." On the other end of the line, there was a long, ragged silence, followed by a sound that was half sob, half gasp of vindication. Isabella had planned for this. She had known the darkness was coming and had forged her own weapon, a tiny vessel of truth to be sent into the future. For Sophia, the discovery was a moment of profound, heartbreaking clarity. The girl she remembered as a vibrant, laughing presence had also been a warrior, laying a trap for her own killer from beyond the grave. The question now was no longer where to find the proof, but what terrible secret was sealed inside that tiny gold circle. What they found next would change everything. The delicate, almost invisible seam on the ring was not just a clever design. It was a gateway to the truth Isabella had died to protect. But opening it without destroying the contents would require a level of skill and technology that pushed the investigation into uncharted territory. If you want to be the first to know what secrets were hidden inside that ring, make sure you're subscribed to our channel and have clicked the notification bell. We're about to peel back another layer of this conspiracy, and you won't want to miss it. Every new discovery brings us closer to justice for Isabella, and your support helps us keep telling these important stories. The atmosphere inside the county's digital forensics lab was thick, with a tension that felt almost surgical. Detective Santiago Cruz stood behind a glass partition, watching as a specialist, a young woman with impossibly steady hands, manipulated Isabella's ring under the powerful lens of a scanning electron microscope. The air hummed with the quiet, efficient whir of computer servers and ventilation systems, a sterile soundtrack to a moment that felt anything but. Cruz's reflection in the glass was a tired, older version of the man who had first taken on this case. He watched the magnified image of the golden ring on a large monitor, its intricate sunburst design now appearing as a vast, alien landscape of microscopic scratches and embedded soil particles. 9 years of silence were contained in that single tiny object, and he could feel the weight of its secrets pressing down on the entire room, a tangible force that made it hard to breathe. For Cruz, this was more than just a piece of evidence. It was a reckoning. For nearly a decade, Ricardo Reyes's smug, condescending smile had been burned into his memory, the smile of a man who knew he was untouchable. He remembered the dismissive tone of the original investigators, the thinly veiled threats from the Reyes family lawyers, and the crushing weight of being ordered to stand down. He had carried the ghost of Isabella with him every day, her unsolved disappearance a constant, personal failure. Now, standing in this cold, clinical room, he felt an overwhelming sense of proximity to the truth. He was the custodian of Sophia's hope and the executor of Isabella's last, desperate plan. The pressure was immense, a physical ache in his chest. Failure was not an option this time. He owed it to the girl who had been so clever, so brave, and so tragically silenced. "Wait a minute." The technician's voice crackled through the intercom, sharp and focused. "I've got something here, on the inner band." Cruz leaned closer to the glass, his eyes fixed on the monitor. The technician manipulated a virtual probe, tracing a line so faint it was almost imperceptible. It was a seam, a hairline fracture in the gold, perfectly integrated into the engraved pattern. It was a masterful piece of custom work, designed not to be seen. Under the microscope's immense magnification, the truth of the ring's construction became undeniable. It was not a solid piece of jewelry. It was a container, a tiny, hollow vessel. The discovery sent a jolt of electricity through Cruz, a sudden, shocking validation that made the hairs on his arms stand up. The note wasn't a metaphor. It was a literal instruction manual left by the victim. The realization dawned on everyone in the lab simultaneously, a shared, silent gasp of understanding. The ring holds the proof. Isabella's words, written in faded blue ink, echoed in Cruz's mind with chilling clarity. He felt a profound, heartbreaking admiration for the 21-year-old woman. Faced with a darkness she could not name but certainly felt, she had not succumbed to fear. Instead, she had forged a shield, a tiny Trojan horse to carry her truth into the future. She had weaponized the one thing her brother found insignificant, a childish piece of sentimental jewelry. Ricardo, in his arrogant dismissal of her, had overlooked the very thing that would become his undoing. It was a brilliant, desperate act of self-preservation, a final move in a deadly chess game she knew she was losing, and it was Cruz's turn to finish it for her. The next phase was fraught with peril. Opening the locket, which had been sealed by 9 years of dirt and corrosion, was a task that required the precision of a bomb disposal expert. One wrong move, one slip of a tool, could irretrievably damage whatever was inside. The team brought in a specialist from the National Archives, an expert in restoring delicate historical artifacts. Using a combination of ultrasonic vibrations and microsurgical tools under a high-powered microscope, he began the painstaking process of working the seam. The room was silent except for the soft clicks of his instruments and the sound of his steady breathing. Cruz watched, his own breath held, feeling as though he were witnessing a sacred rite. Every minute that passed felt like an hour, the tension stretching to an almost unbearable thinness. They were so close, yet the truth remained locked away behind a fragile wall of gold. Miles away, in her small house surrounded by her fragrant garden, Sophia Morales sat by the telephone, unable to eat or sleep. She clutched the small, framed photograph of Isabella, her thumb tracing the outline of the girl's smiling face. With every passing hour, the fragile hope that had ignited in her heart battled against the familiar dread that had been her companion for 9 long years. She remembered the day Isabella had received the ring, how she had run to show it to her, her eyes sparkling with pure joy. "Papa says it's to remind me I'm his sunshine," she had said. Sophia prayed to a God she wasn't sure she still believed in, pleading that the ring had protected Isabella's final message. She had put her faith in Detective Cruz, but more than that, she had put her faith in Isabella. She knew the girl's spirit, her quiet strength, and she believed with every fiber of her being that Isabella would not have left them without a map out of the darkness. A soft click echoed in the lab, a sound that was barely audible but carried the force of a thunderclap. The locket was open. The specialist, his face beaded with sweat, did not move for a long moment. Then, with a pair of impossibly fine tweezers, he reached into the tiny compartment. He carefully extracted a small, dark object no bigger than a fingernail and placed it on a sterile white tray. It was a micro SD card. The plastic casing was warped, and the metallic contacts were clouded with the unmistakable tarnish of moisture and time. A digital ghost from 2014. The sight was both a triumph and a terror. They had it. The proof Isabella had died to protect was physically in their hands. A tiny rectangle of plastic and silicon that held the key to a 9-year-old murder. It was the ultimate validation of Isabella's desperate, brilliant plan. But the victory was short-lived, immediately overshadowed by a new, formidable obstacle. The lab's lead data recovery expert examined the card under a separate microscope, his expression growing more grim by the second. He turned to Cruz, his face a mask of professional concern. "Detective, the card is in bad shape. Severe water damage, corrosion on the primary contacts. I'm not exaggerating when I say it's a miracle it hasn't completely disintegrated." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the room. "We can try to recover the data, but the chances are slim. The file system is likely corrupted beyond repair. We might get fragments, if we're lucky, or we might get nothing at all." The hope that had filled the room just moments before evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard reality of their new challenge. The truth was right there, but it was trapped inside a digital tomb. The words of the forensics expert hung in the sterile air of the lab, heavy and suffocating. "The file system is likely corrupted beyond repair." For Detective Santiago Cruz, the statement was a physical blow, a punch to the gut that stole his breath and left a cold, familiar dread in its place. He stared at the magnified image of the micro SD card on the monitor. A tiny, damaged vessel that had been their beacon of hope. For a fleeting, glorious moment, he had believed they had won, that Isabella's cleverness had transcended death and time. Now, that hope was crumbling into digital dust. He felt the ghost of his past failure creeping back, the cynical voice in his head whispering that the Reyes family was, and always would be, untouchable. The truth was right there, inches away, but it was locked in a prison of corroded silicon he couldn't breach. Just as the silence in the room became unbearable, the lead data recovery specialist cleared his throat, pulling Cruz back from the edge of despair. "There is one last option," he said, his tone cautious, "but it's extreme." He explained a procedure known as chip-off data recovery. It involved physically desoldering the memory chip from the card's circuit board and connecting it to a specialized reader, bypassing the damaged controller entirely. The risks were enormous. The process was irreversible and could easily fracture the delicate chip, permanently destroying any data it held. "It's the Hail Mary of data recovery, Detective," the specialist concluded. "It could give us everything, or it could turn the last shred of evidence into useless sand." The decision fell to Cruz. He had to authorize a procedure that could either solve the murder or obliterate the only real proof they had forever. While the lab team began the delicate preparations for the high-risk procedure, Cruz knew he couldn't afford to be idle. The digital evidence might be a dead end, but the human element of the case was still a live wire. He needed more than just a corrupted file. He needed context, motive, and a voice from the past. He pulled the original 2015 case file and stared at the photograph of Javi Garcia. Back then, Javi was the prime suspect, the poor, secret boyfriend with no alibi. The accusation had shattered his life. Cruz looked at the picture of the young, hopeful artist and felt a pang of guilt. The system, under the thumb of the Reyes family, had not only failed to find a killer, but had also created another victim. Finding Javi was now a priority, not just for the case, but as an act of delayed justice. He had to find the man who knew the secrets Isabella couldn't write in her final note. Tracking down Javi Garcia was like chasing a phantom. The artist had vanished from Acapulco shortly after the case went cold, leaving behind a ruined reputation and a studio full of unsold canvases. He had changed his name, cut ties with his old life, and, effectively, erased himself. Cruz's investigation turned into a painstaking, analog process of tracking down old gallery owners who barely remembered him and friends who hadn't heard from him in years. For days, every lead turned into a dead end, a testament to how thoroughly Javi had tried to disappear. Finally, a tip from a disgruntled former landlord led Cruz to a small, forgotten fishing village 300 miles down the coast, a place where people went to be forgotten. Javi wasn't just hiding from the law, he was hiding from the memory of Isabella and the life that had been stolen from him. The man Cruz found was a ghost of the person in the file. Javi lived in a dilapidated beachfront shack, the air thick with the smell of turpentine and salt. He was gaunt and bearded, with the haunted eyes of someone who hadn't had a peaceful night's sleep in nearly a decade. When Cruz identified himself, Javi's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He didn't see a detective offering a chance at justice. He saw the living embodiment of the institution that had branded him a potential killer and destroyed his world. "You have a lot of nerve," Javi snarled, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You're about 9 years too late to play the hero detective." The wall of bitterness around him was thick and impenetrable, built brick by brick over years of pain, isolation, and false accusation. Cruz didn't try to defend himself or the system. He knew he had no right. Instead, he spoke quietly, not as a cop, but as a man who also carried the weight of this case. He told Javi they had found her body, buried in a garden on the hotel grounds. Javi's hostile facade began to crack, a flicker of raw, untended grief showing in his eyes. Then, Cruz played his final card. "We found the ring, Javi. She was still wearing it." The mention of the ring was the key. It was their secret, a sacred pact between two lovers against a gathering storm. The anger in Javi's eyes dissolved, replaced by a wave of sorrow so profound it brought him to his knees. The wall of bitterness crumbled, and the story he had been forced to hold inside for 9 long years finally came pouring out in a torrent of pain and regret. Through his tears, Javi confirmed everything Cruz had suspected. He described Isabella's escalating fear of Ricardo in the weeks before her death, how her brother's jealousy over their father's new will had morphed into something cold and menacing. Then he told Cruz the secret of the ring. It had been Isabella's idea, a desperate plan B. "He's going to do something to me, Javi," she had confessed, her voice trembling. "He looks at me like I'm not even a person anymore." Javi recounted how they found a discreet jeweler who could hollow out the ring and how she had started carrying a tiny audio recorder. Her final words to him on the subject echoed in his memory. "He would never look here," she had said, touching the ring. "If anything happens, you have to tell them. This is my only proof." Javi's testimony provided the motive and the method, a human voice that gave context to the cold, digital evidence. Armed with this powerful new testimony, Cruz finally had the ammunition he needed to go after the conspiracy of silence. He secured a warrant to unseal Ricardo Reyes's financial records from early 2015. What he found was a meticulously laundered trail of hush money. In the 2 months following Isabella's disappearance, Ricardo had made a series of structured cash withdrawals totaling over $500,000. Shortly thereafter, 2 significant deposits appeared in the offshore accounts of 2 key individuals, the hotel's head of security at the time and a police captain named Mateo Vargas, the very man who had personally overseen and shut down the original investigation. The case had just exploded from a single homicide into a wide-ranging conspiracy involving bribery and corruption at the highest levels of local law enforcement. Cruz flew to Miami to confront the former security chief, a man named Alvarez, who was now living a life of opulent retirement. When presented with the undeniable proof of the wire transfer, Alvarez's sun-tanned composure evaporated. He confessed immediately, his words tumbling out in a desperate attempt to save himself. He admitted that Ricardo had paid him $200,000 in cash to permanently delete a 2-hour segment of security footage from New Year's Eve. The footage covered the private elevator to the penthouse and the hallway directly outside the family suite. He told me it was a private family dispute, that his sister had a breakdown. Alvarez stammered. I knew it was a lie, but the money, I have a family. His confession was the first concrete crack in the wall of the cover-up, irrefutable proof of obstruction of justice. The corruption of Captain Vargas was an even more sickening betrayal. He hadn't just been paid to look the other way. He had actively steered the original investigation towards Javi, creating a convenient scapegoat while the real killer walked free. The financial records showed that a shell corporation owned by the Reyes Group had purchased a luxury condo in Vargas's wife's name just 6 months after he officially declared the case cold. Vargas had not just been complicit, he had been a key architect of the 9-year lie. This discovery shifted the entire dynamic of the investigation. Cruz wasn't just hunting a murderer anymore. He was taking on a corrupt system that Ricardo had bought and paid for, a system that would protect its own at all costs and would not hesitate to crush him if he got too close. As Cruz sat in his car outside Vargas's precinct, contemplating the immense risk of his next move, his phone buzzed. It was the forensics lab. He answered, his heart pounding against his ribs. The specialist's voice on the other end was strained, exhausted, but laced with an undercurrent of pure adrenaline. "Detective," he said, the connection crackling slightly. "The chip-off worked. It's a miracle, but it worked." He paused, and Cruz could hear the faint sound of other people's excited voices in the background. "We have a file. It's heavily damaged, just a fragment, less than 30 seconds long. But it's audio. We have audio from inside that ring." In that moment, all the disparate threads of the case, Javi's testimony, the erased footage, the financial corruption, converged on a single, ghostly echo from the past, a soundbite that held the power to burn an empire to the ground. The single, fragmented audio file felt less like evidence and more like a sacred relic, a ghost captured in a digital bottle. Detective Santiago Cruz stood in a soundproofed room, the air still and heavy, as a technician queued up the 30-second clip. For 9 years, Isabella Reyes had been a silent victim, a name in a dusty file. In a moment, she was about to speak. Cruz felt a profound and heavy sense of responsibility, as if he were the chosen priest for this final, desperate confession. He was not just listening for clues. He was listening for the soul of a woman he had never met, but had sworn to avenge. He knew that the sound he was about to hear would change everything, not just for the case, but for him. The silence before the playback was deafening, a final, deep breath before plunging into the icy waters of the past. The technician hit the play button. A burst of static hissed from the speakers, the sound of 9 years of decay. Then, a voice, young and desperate, cut through the noise, shockingly clear. "It's my birthright, Ricardo." It was Isabella. Her voice was not pleading. It was defiant, filled with the fire of someone making a final stand. The sound was so vivid, so present, that Cruz flinched as if she were in the room with them. A second voice followed, cold and dripping with a chilling, dismissive rage. It was Ricardo. "Inherit this." The words were followed not by an argument, but by a sickeningly wet, percussive thud, the unmistakable sound of a heavy object striking flesh and bone. A soft final exhalation of air, and then nothing. The audio cut out, leaving behind a silence more horrifying than the violence it had captured. In that hollow silence, the case was no longer about motive or opportunity. It was about the raw, unfiltered brutality of that final second. The audio was a window into the heart of the crime, a visceral, horrifying glimpse of the moment a brother's greed and jealousy curdled into murderous rage. Cruz felt a cold fury settle deep in his bones, a feeling so intense it was almost serene. This was the proof Isabella had died to preserve, the truth she had carried with her to a shallow, unmarked grave. It was a perfect, damning fragment of evil. The sound of that impact would be forever burned into his memory, a ghost that would not rest until justice was served. Ricardo Reyes was no longer a charismatic businessman with a dark secret. He was the monster whose voice now echoed in the detective's mind. Legally, however, the audio was a double-edged sword. It was powerful, but its brevity made it vulnerable. Cruz could already hear the defense attorneys in his head, spinning narratives of a family argument taken out of context, of an accidental fall. The fragment was the heart of his case, but it needed an ironclad body of corroborating evidence built around it. The confessions from the security chief and the corrupt police captain were no longer just about a cover-up. They were now crucial pieces that authenticated the timeline of the murder itself. The erased footage, the hush money, Javi's testimony, every single piece now served to amplify the terrible truth contained in those 30 seconds. Cruz's mission was no longer just to expose a killer, but to meticulously dismantle the entire fortress of lies Ricardo had built around his crime. He decided to start with the weakest link in that fortress. He didn't just confront the disgraced Captain Mateo Vargas with bank statements. He brought him into the same soundproofed room and played him the audio. As Isabella's final defiant words filled the small space, the color drained from Vargas's face. When the sickening thud of the impact echoed from the speakers, Vargas physically recoiled, his eyes wide with a horror that was 9 years too late. This was the reality of the family dispute he had been paid to ignore. He had not just buried a file, he had buried a woman. He had enabled a monster. The weight of his complicity seemed to crush him, the years of willful ignorance collapsing under the undeniable sound of a life being violently extinguished. The bribe money had bought him a comfortable life, but in that moment, he understood it had cost him his soul. The dam of deceit broke. Vargas confessed everything, the words spilling out in a desperate, pathetic torrent of self-preservation. He recounted the clandestine meeting with Ricardo in a deserted parking garage in January 2015. He described Ricardo's unnerving calm as he laid out the plan, handing over a briefcase filled with cash and a fabricated narrative. "She was a troubled girl, Captain," Ricardo had said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "This is a mercy for the family." Vargas admitted to deliberately planting false leads pointing to Javi Garcia, to burying forensic requests from a young, persistent Detective Cruz, and to personally signing off on the report that declared Isabella a voluntary missing person. He provided a detailed map of the conspiracy, naming every person who had taken Reyes' money to look the other way. The confession was a bombshell, revealing a conspiracy far more extensive than Cruz had imagined. It wasn't just a handful of corrupt individuals. It was a systemic infection. Vargas named a junior district attorney who had since become a judge as the one who had quashed Cruz's repeated requests for search warrants on the hotel grounds. He implicated a forensics technician who had lost key samples from Isabella's room. Ricardo had not just bribed a few people. He had bought and paid for a personalized, boutique justice system, one designed specifically to make his sister disappear from the public record as completely as he had made her disappear from the world. The Reyes empire was not just built on luxury hotels. It was built on a foundation of corruption that ran through the very institutions meant to protect the innocent. The revelation fundamentally changed the nature of the fight. Cruz was no longer a detective investigating a homicide. He was a lone soldier waging war against a shadow government run by the Reyes family. He could no longer trust his own department or the local judiciary. Any official move he made would be telegraphed directly to his enemy. Realizing the immense danger, he went off the grid. He assembled a small, hand-picked team of detectives he trusted implicitly, men and women who owed him their careers, and whose integrity was beyond question. They set up a clandestine command center in a rented warehouse on the industrial outskirts of the city, a place far from the prying eyes of Ricardo's network. The investigation had officially gone black, a secret war for justice being fought from the shadows. It was in this secure, anonymous location that Cruz made the difficult decision to play the audio for Sofia and Javi. He needed their final, formal identification of the voices, but he also knew it would be an act of profound cruelty. For Sofia, hearing Isabella's voice, so full of life and defiance in her final moments, was both a blessing and a curse. Tears streamed down her face as she listened, her hand gripping the small, framed photograph of the girl she loved. It was the sound she had been waiting 9 years to hear, the ultimate vindication of her faith, but it was also the sound of a promise being broken, the sound of her failure to protect her. The grief was immense, but beneath it, her resolve hardened into unbreakable steel. This was Isabella's final command, and Sofia would see it through to the end. For Javi Garcia, the experience was a violent exorcism. For 9 years he had been haunted by the ghost of public suspicion, branded as the man who might have harmed the woman he loved. Hearing Ricardo's cold, murderous voice was like a physical release, the lifting of a burden so heavy it had crushed his spirit. The rage he had directed at the world for so long finally had a target, a face, a voice. The sound of the impact was a horror that would never leave him, but it was also his liberation. The broken, bitter man who had hidden from the world for a decade was gone, replaced by a witness with a fire in his eyes. He looked at Cruz and, for the first time, saw not an enemy but an ally. "Tell me what you need me to do," he said, his voice steady and clear. "I'll tell the whole world what he did to her." With the final pieces of the puzzle falling into place, the scope of the case became breathtakingly clear. The fragmented audio was the soul of the crime. The confessions of Vargas and Alvarez were the skeleton, providing the structure of the conspiracy. And the testimonies of Sofia and Javi were the heart, giving the case its powerful emotional pulse. Cruz now had an airtight narrative, a chain of evidence that led directly and inexorably to Ricardo Heiress. He bypassed the corrupted local judiciary and went to the state attorney general's office, laying out the entire sordid tale of murder, bribery, and systemic corruption. Late on a Tuesday night, armed with a warrant from the highest legal authority in the state, Cruz and his clandestine team prepared to move. The serpent in the sun was about to discover that his fortress of lies was nothing but a house of cards. The night air over Acapulco was thick and humid, carrying the distant sounds of music and laughter from the beachfront clubs below. But on the top floor of the Reyes Grand Acapulco, the only sound was the hushed, methodical sweep of a tactical team securing the penthouse. Detective Santiago Cruz led the way, his face a grim, determined mask. They moved through rooms of obscene luxury, past silk-draped walls and abstract art that cost more than Cruz's house, with the silent, deadly efficiency of ghosts. They found Ricardo Heiress on the expansive marble balcony, illuminated by the soft glow of the city lights and the cold blue light of his cell phone. He was closing a multi-million-dollar deal, his voice a smooth, confident purr of power, completely oblivious to the fact that his reign was about to come to a violent, ignominious end. Ricardo's initial reaction was not fear, but a profound, almost theatrical indignation. As the tactical officers fanned out, securing the balcony, he ended his call with a clipped, annoyed sigh and turned to face Cruz. A slow, condescending smile spread across his handsome face. "Detective Cruz," he said, his voice dripping with amused contempt, "to what do I owe this dramatic intrusion? If you wanted an appointment, my assistant could have squeezed you in next month." He gestured dismissively at the heavily armed officers surrounding him. "This is all terribly unnecessary. I'm sure my lawyers will be very interested to hear about the harassment of a private citizen. You are making a monumental mistake, a career-ending one, I assure you." He was a king in his castle, utterly convinced that its walls were still impenetrable. The interrogation room was a world away from that gilded penthouse. It was a sterile gray box in the bowels of the secret warehouse, a place stripped of all comfort and status. The air was cold and smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee. Ricardo sat at a bare metal table, his hands cuffed in front of him, the sleeves of his $1,000 shirt wrinkled. They had taken his watch, his phone, his perfectly tailored jacket, all the external signifiers of his power. Now, he was just a man in a cold room, bathed in the unforgiving hum of a single fluorescent light fixture. He tried to maintain his air of arrogant detachment, but the bare concrete walls seemed to absorb his confidence, leaving behind a nervous, twitching energy in his jaw that he couldn't quite control. This was a cage, and for the first time in his life, he was the one inside it. Cruz began the interrogation with a calm, methodical recitation of the facts, his voice a flat, steady drone. He laid out the discovery of the body, the details of the shallow grave in the meditation garden, the sworn confession of the former security chief, and the damning financial records that proved the bribery of Captain Vargas. With each new piece of evidence, Ricardo offered a polished, well-rehearsed rebuttal. The body was a tragic discovery, but it proved nothing. The security chief was a disgruntled ex-employee looking for a payday. Vargas was a known corrupt cop trying to trade a lie for a lighter sentence. He leaned back in his chair, a smug look on his face. "You have nothing, detective," he sneered. "Just the desperate stories of desperate men. You've built a fantasy on a foundation of sand." Behind the one-way mirror, Sofia Morales stood with her hands pressed against the cold glass, her breath fogging the surface. Watching Ricardo lie so effortlessly, so completely, was like a physical poison seeping into her veins. She saw not the powerful CEO, but the hollowed-out shell of the little boy she had once known, a boy who had grown into a monster. Every denial he uttered was a fresh desecration of Isabella's memory. She clutched the small, framed photograph of Isabella so tightly that her knuckles turned white, the sharp edge of the frame digging into her palm. She didn't need to hear a confession. She could see the truth in the cold, dead emptiness of his eyes, the same emptiness she had seen flicker into existence all those years ago. Her presence was a silent, suffocating weight, the judgment of a mother he could not see but could surely feel. A moment later, Javi Garcia was escorted into the observation room, and the atmosphere instantly shifted from one of quiet grief to a volatile, simmering rage. His eyes locked onto Ricardo's image in the mirror, and a low, guttural sound escaped his throat. For 9 years, this man's face had haunted his nightmares, the architect of his personal and professional ruin. To see him now, stripped of his power, was not satisfying. It was infuriating. He saw the smug tilt of Ricardo's head, the confidence smirk, and all the pain and bitterness of the last decade coalesced into a single, burning point of hatred. "You bastard," he whispered, his voice shaking with a rage so profound it was almost silent. He took a step toward the glass, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists, every fiber of his being wanting to shatter the barrier between them. Back in the interrogation room, Cruz slid a single, clear plastic evidence bag across the cold metal table. It made a soft, scraping sound that seemed to echo in the tense silence. Inside, nestled on a bed of sterile white cotton, was the gold sunburst ring. It had been cleaned and polished, and it gleamed with a fierce, defiant light under the harsh fluorescent glare. Ricardo's eyes snapped down to it, and for the first time, the impenetrable mask of his composure cracked. A visible tremor ran through him. His gaze was fixed on the ring, a tiny golden ghost from a past he had tried to bury under 9 years of soil and lies. He had dismissed it, mocked it, forgotten it. And now, here it was, the one thing he had never considered, sitting on the table between him and the detective, an undeniable testament to his sister's final, brilliant act of defiance. "Isabella left a message for you, Ricardo," Cruz said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a death sentence. He didn't elaborate. He didn't mention a micro SD card or an audio file. He simply nodded to a technician outside the room. A moment of absolute suffocating silence descended, broken only by the low hum of the lights. Ricardo's eyes darted from the ring to Cruz, a flicker of genuine confusion, and perhaps for the first time, fear showing in their depths. He leaned forward almost imperceptibly, his body tensing, bracing for an impact he could not anticipate. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with the electric potential of a truth that had been suppressed for 139 days, and was now, finally, about to be set free. A sharp hiss of static erupted from a small, concealed speaker in the corner of the room, making Ricardo physically jolt. Then, a voice, impossibly clear and alive, tore through the electronic noise, filling the small, gray room with its vibrant, defiant energy. "It's my birthright, Ricardo." Isabella's voice. Hearing it after all this time was a violent, supernatural event. It was not a memory. It was a presence. Ricardo gasped, his face draining of all color, his body recoiling in the metal chair as if he had been physically struck. The sound of his dead sister's voice, so full of life in her final, desperate moments, was the ghost he never believed would return to haunt him. His carefully constructed world, built on a foundation of lies, began to shatter into a million irreparable pieces. Then came the second voice, his own, a venomous, chilling whisper that seemed to suck all the warmth from the room. "Inherit this!" The sound of his own preserved evil was a revelation. A mirror reflecting a monstrosity he had long ago buried. He remembered the weight of the marble statuette in his hand, the feel of it. His eyes, wide with a dawning, panicked horror, were no longer looking at Cruz, but through him, into the blood-soaked memory of that night in the penthouse. He was no longer in the interrogation room. He was back on the balcony, the warm New Year's Eve air on his skin, the smell of champagne, and his sister's perfume in his nostrils, her defiant eyes staring back at him for one last, fleeting moment. The sound that followed was the punctuation mark on his entire life. A sickeningly wet, percussive thud, followed by a soft, final exhalation of air, the sound of a life being brutally extinguished. And then, a profound and terrible silence. The audio clip ended, but the sound of the impact continued to reverberate in the small room, a ghost echo that would never fade. Ricardo sat frozen for a long second, his face a grotesque mask of sweat and disbelief. The arrogant CEO, the charismatic visionary, the grieving brother, all of his carefully crafted personas had been annihilated, burned away by 30 seconds of raw, undeniable truth. All that was left was the cowering, pathetic monster underneath. He did not confess with words. He confessed with a primal scream of pure, cornered terror. With a sudden, explosive movement, he lunged across the table, not at Detective Cruz, but at the wall where the speaker was hidden. He slammed his cuffed hands against the concrete, again and again, a desperate, feral attempt to smash the source of the sound, to silence the ghost, to physically destroy the past that had finally caught up to him. It was a complete and total unraveling, a violent, physical admission of guilt, more powerful and damning than any written statement. The sound of his own voice had broken him, forcing the ugly, brutal truth out of the darkness and into the unforgiving light of the interrogation room. Cruz's team burst into the room, tackling Ricardo and pinning him to the cold floor as he thrashed and screamed, his incoherent cries echoing off the bare concrete walls. Behind the one-way mirror, the spell was broken. Sofia Morales collapsed onto a nearby chair, her body racked with silent, shuddering sobs, a cathartic, agonizing release of 9 years of pent-up grief and righteous anger. Javi Garcia stood perfectly still, his fists still clenched, but his face was no longer a mask of rage. A single tear traced a clean path down his cheek. It was over. The serpent, so comfortable and powerful in the warmth of his self-made son, had finally been exposed, brought down by the faint, determined whisper of the sister he had so monstrously wronged. The trial of Ricardo Reyes was the most sensational legal battle Mexico had seen in a generation, a public spectacle that laid bare the rot beneath a veneer of glamour and power. The prosecution, led by a steely-eyed state attorney, built their case around the chilling 30-second audio fragment recovered from the ring. They called it Isabella's Ghost, a voice from the grave that spoke an undeniable truth. Ricardo's high-priced legal team, a veritable army of the country's best defense attorneys, fought desperately to have the audio dismissed as circumstantial and inadmissible. They argued it was a recording of a family argument taken out of context, a tragic accident, not a premeditated murder. But their arguments, however polished, sounded hollow and desperate against the sickening final thud that had been captured on the recording. The courtroom would fall into a heavy, horrified silence every time it was played for the jury. The prosecution methodically constructed an ironclad fortress of corroborating evidence around that single audio file. Javi Garcia took the stand, his voice steady and clear as he recounted Isabella's growing fear and the secret of the ring. His testimony was not that of a bitter, broken man, but of a loving partner, finally given the chance to honor the woman he had lost, painting a vivid picture of her intelligence and bravery. Next came the disgraced Captain Vargas and the former security chief Alvarez, who, in exchange for plea deals, detailed the entire conspiracy of the cover-up. They laid out the timeline of the bribes, the orders to erase footage, and the deliberate campaign to frame Javi. Their confessions transformed the case from a simple homicide into a sprawling saga of corruption, proving Ricardo's guilt not just in the act of murder, but in the 9-year conspiracy to conceal it. The financial records were the final, irrefutable nail in Ricardo's coffin. Forensic accountants presented a clear, damning trail of laundered money flowing from Reyes's personal accounts into the offshore holdings of Vargas, Alvarez, and a half-dozen other key figures who had helped maintain the lie. The defense had no answer for this, no plausible explanation for the sudden, inexplicable wealth that had appeared for these individuals in the months following Isabella's disappearance. Each bank statement, each wire transfer receipt, was a brick in the wall of Ricardo's guilt. The jury saw not just a man accused of killing his sister, but the architect of a vast criminal enterprise, a man who believed his wealth made him a god, capable of rewriting reality itself with a checkbook. The illusion of his power, so carefully maintained for a decade, evaporated under the harsh, objective light of financial forensics. Sofia Morales was the prosecution's final witness. She did not speak of evidence or timelines. Dressed in a simple black dress, she walked to the stand with a quiet, unshakable dignity. She spoke of the Isabella she knew, the warm, vibrant young woman who dreamed of studying art in Paris, the girl who loved the smell of the ocean after a storm. She held up the small, framed photograph for the jury to see, her voice thick with emotion, as she described the day Isabella received the gold ring from her father. She said it was to remind her she was his sunshine, Sofia whispered, her words cutting through the sterile courtroom air. Her testimony was not about the crime. It was about the victim. She gave Isabella her humanity back, transforming her from a name in a case file into a beloved daughter whose life had been brutally stolen. In that moment, Ricardo was no longer just a murderer. He was the man who had extinguished that sunshine. The verdict came after only 4 hours of deliberation. As the jury foreman stood, a hushed silence fell over the packed courtroom. Ricardo Reyes, who had maintained a facade of bored arrogance throughout the trial, finally showed a flicker of fear, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the defense table. The foreman's voice was steady and devoid of emotion as he read the verdict. On the charge of first-degree murder, we, the jury, find the defendant, Ricardo Reyes, guilty. A collective gasp swept through the gallery. The foreman continued, delivering guilty verdicts on every subsequent charge: conspiracy, bribery, obstruction of justice. The camera flashes were blinding, a chaotic storm of light capturing the precise moment in Empire, and a man, finally and irrevocably, fell. Ricardo did not react. He simply stared forward, his face a hollow, defeated mask, the serpent finally stripped of its sun-warmed skin. Ricardo Reyes was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. The judge, in his final remarks, called the crime an act of monstrous arrogance and profound familial betrayal. A murder committed not in a moment of passion, but as a cold, calculated business decision. The fall of the House of Reyes was as swift as it was brutal. The scandal wiped out billions in market value overnight. The Reyes Hotel Group, once a titan of the luxury hospitality industry, became a toxic asset. Partners pulled out, contracts were canceled, and the brand became synonymous with murder and corruption. Within a year, the company was forced into bankruptcy, its assets sold off piece by piece to competitors. The Reyes Grand Acapulco, the jewel in their crown, was sold for a fraction of its worth, its name forever tarnished by the secret it had kept buried in its garden. The legal fallout did not end with Ricardo. A special state investigation, triggered by the evidence uncovered in the murder trial, led to a sweeping crackdown on the systemic corruption he had financed. The now disgraced Judge Vargas and former security chief Alvarez received significant prison sentences for their roles in the conspiracy. More than a dozen other officials, from low-level clerks to high-ranking city administrators, were indicted on charges of bribery and obstruction. The case became a landmark moment, a brutal and public cleansing of a system that had allowed wealth to supersede justice. It sent a shockwave through the state's political and law enforcement establishments, a clear and undeniable message that no one, no matter how powerful or well-connected, was truly above the law. The justice Isabella had been denied for 9 years was finally served, not just to her killer, but to everyone who had been complicit in his crime. In the aftermath, Javi Garcia's name was officially, publicly, and completely cleared. He became a reluctant symbol of resilience, a man who had survived the dual tragedies of losing the love of his life and being falsely accused of her murder. He gave a single, heartfelt television interview, not to talk about his own pain, but to ensure the world remembered Isabella not as a victim, but as the hero of her own story. She was the one who solved her own murder, he said, his voice filled with a mixture of pride and profound sorrow. She was smarter and braver than any of us knew. With the cloud of suspicion finally lifted, he began to paint again, his canvases exploding with a vibrant, raw energy. His first exhibition, titled Sunshine, sold out in a single night. The proceeds used to establish a foundation in Isabella's name. Sofia Morales found her peace not in the courtroom victory, but in the quiet solitude of her garden. The constant, gnawing weight of guilt and unanswered questions that had burdened her for 9 years was finally gone, replaced by a deep, settled calm. She had fulfilled her promise to the girl she loved like a daughter. She attended Isabella's second funeral, a small, private ceremony where she was finally laid to rest beside her father. Sofia placed a single, perfect white rose on the headstone, a final, silent conversation between two souls. She returned to her life of quiet retirement, her days filled with the simple, honest work of tending to her flowers. The small, framed photograph of Isabella remained on her mantelpiece, but now, when she looked at it, she felt not sorrow, but a quiet, profound sense of love and closure. The Reyes Grand Acapulco was eventually purchased by a rival hotel chain and underwent a complete rebranding. The new owners, sensitive to the property's dark history, made a remarkable gesture. They reached out to Sofia and Javi, seeking their guidance. The infamous meditation garden was respectfully demolished. In its place, they constructed the Isabella Reyes Memorial Wing for the Arts, a beautiful, light-filled gallery and studio space dedicated to showcasing and funding talented local artists from underprivileged backgrounds. It was the perfect tribute, a way of finally giving Isabella the life she had dreamed of, a life connected to the art and the people she loved, far from the cold, sterile world of corporate boardrooms. Her legacy was no longer one of tragedy, but of creation and opportunity. Detective Santiago Cruz was hailed as a hero, but he shunned the spotlight. For him, the case was never about glory, it was about redemption. He had closed the file on the ghost that had haunted his career for a decade. He quietly accepted a promotion to lead a new statewide cold case unit, specializing in cases that had been compromised by wealth and influence. His success with the Reyes case became a new standard for investigative integrity. He kept only one memento from the investigation, a copy of the forensic report on the micro SD card. It served as a constant reminder that the most powerful truths can often be found in the smallest, most overlooked of places, and that justice, no matter how long it is delayed, is always worth fighting for. The gold sunburst ring, having served its final, extraordinary purpose, was released from evidence. By legal right, it should have gone to Ricardo as the last surviving family member, but he was in no position to claim it. Instead, by a special disposition from the court, it was given to Sofia Morales. She accepted it with trembling hands, the small circle of gold feeling both impossibly light and unbearably heavy. It was a symbol of a father's love, a young woman's ingenuity, and a murderer's undoing. She did not wear it. Instead, she placed it in a small velvet-lined box and set it on her mantelpiece, right next to Isabella's smiling photograph. There it would remain, a silent, gleaming monument to a promise that had been made in a whisper and, after 9 long years, had finally been kept. And so, the story of the Serpent in the Sun came to a close. It was a brutal tale of greed and betrayal, but it was also a testament to the enduring power of love and the stubborn persistence of truth. It served as a stark reminder that empires built on secrets are destined to crumble, for they are built on foundations of sand. While bodies can be buried and lies can be bought, a single, desperate message, cast into the future by a hand guided by courage, can possess enough power to tear down walls, expose monsters, and ultimately bring a whisper of justice echoing back from the silence. Isabella Reyes had been stolen from the world, but in her final moments, she had ensured that her voice and the truth would never truly be lost. The story of the Serpent in the Sun did not end with the clang of a prison door. It ended in the quiet, sun-drenched spaces of the new Isabella Reyes Memorial Wing for the Arts, a place built directly over the scarred earth where she had been buried. The transformation was a profound, defiant act of reclamation. Where Ricardo had built a sterile garden to hide his monstrous secret, a new generation now created beauty, their laughter and creativity filling the halls. The very ground that had once been a tomb was now a foundation for hope, a testament to the idea that even from the darkest of places, something vibrant and new can be cultivated. It was Isabella's final, posthumous victory, a legacy of creation triumphing over an act of brutal destruction. The hotel, once a monument to a family's corrupt power, had become a monument to the enduring spirit of the daughter they tried to erase. In the end, Ricardo Reyes was not defeated by a brilliant detective or a flawless legal strategy. He was defeated by a ghost, a 30-second audio fragment preserved by his sister's love and foresight. He had built an empire of silence, using his immense wealth to buy complicity and bury the truth under a decade of carefully constructed lies. He believed he was invincible, a modern-day pharaoh entombed in a pyramid of his own making. But he failed to account for the one variable that money cannot control, the fierce, stubborn persistence of a truth that refuses to stay buried. He had dismissed his sister's ring as a childish trinket, just as he had dismissed her spirit as insignificant. It was this arrogance, this profound inability to see the value in anything but power, that ultimately became his undoing, proving that the smallest whisper can topple the most formidable of kings. The gold sunburst ring, the story's silent, constant witness, now rests in a small velvet box on Sofia Morales' mantelpiece. It is not a trophy of victory, nor is it a morbid reminder of a tragedy. It is something more sacred. It is a symbol of a promise kept, a physical embodiment of Isabella's final, desperate act of courage. It represents the extraordinary power that can be hidden in ordinary things, a father's love, a young woman's defiance, a friend's loyalty. For Sofia, the ring is a daily reminder that her grief was not in vain, that her faith in the girl she loved was justified. It sits next to Isabella's smiling photograph, a tiny, golden sun that, against all odds, managed to break through the darkest and longest of nights, bringing with it the cleansing light of truth. The case sent a seismic shockwave through the region, proving that justice, though often delayed, is not always denied. The fall of Ricardo Reyes was not an isolated event. it was a catalyst for a painful but necessary reckoning. The extensive web of corruption he had woven was meticulously unraveled, and the subsequent trials of public officials became a brutal, public lesson in accountability. The name Reyes was no longer a symbol of aspirational luxury, but a cautionary tale about the corrosive nature of unchecked power. For the first time in a generation, the people of Acapulco saw that the fortified walls of the elite were not impenetrable, that a system designed to protect the powerful could, with enough courage and persistence, be forced to serve the people it was meant to. For Javi Garcia, peace came not from revenge, but from creation. He poured all the pain, rage, and love of the past decade into his art, and his Sunshine exhibition became a national sensation. He used the proceeds to launch the Isabella Reyes Foundation, an organization dedicated to providing scholarships and studio space to young, underprivileged artists, the very people Isabella had championed in her own quiet rebellion against her family's world. He became the custodian of her true legacy, ensuring that her name would be remembered not for how she died, but for the passion with which she lived. He finally found a way to honor her, not by dwelling in the darkness of the past, but by building a brighter, more beautiful future in her name. The story of the serpent in the sun is over, but the battle against the shadows it exposed is far from finished. Every city, every institution, has its own secrets buried just beneath the surface, protected by walls of wealth and influence. Isabella's story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the key to unlocking those secrets lies with the most unexpected people. This case was just the beginning of a much larger conversation about justice and power. If you believe these stories need to be told, please subscribe to our channel and join our community. We will continue to investigate cases where the truth is fighting to be heard, because we believe that no secret should be allowed to rest in peace. The ultimate irony is found in Ricardo's own words, captured forever in that chilling audio file, "Inherit this." He intended it as a final, cruel dismissal of his sister's birthright. But in the end, his words became a prophecy with a meaning he could never have conceived. Isabella did inherit. She inherited a legacy of justice that he could never have purchased. Her name, not his, is now etched onto the walls of the art wing that stands as a beacon of hope. He was left with an inheritance of his own, a cold prison cell, a shattered empire, and a name that will forever be synonymous with fratricide and disgrace. He tried to steal her future, but in doing so, he only succeeded in cementing her immortality while erasing himself from any future worth having. Detective Santiago Cruz continued his work, but the Reyes case had changed him. He now leads a special cold case unit, a team of investigators who specialize in unraveling crimes that have been deliberately obscured by power and corruption. He carries the weight of Isabella's case not as a burden, but as a standard, a moral compass that guides him through the murky waters of his work. He knows that for every case like Isabella's that is solved, there are a dozen more waiting in dusty file boxes, their truths silenced by money and fear. His work is a quiet, ongoing promise to those forgotten victims that as long as there are people like him and like Sophia, no one is ever truly beyond the reach of justice. In the end, a single sheet of paper decided everything. A note, hidden for 9 years, was a seed of truth planted in the darkness, waiting patiently for a single ray of light to find it. It teaches us that no wall is high enough, no vault is secure enough to contain a story that needs to be told. Empires can fall, fortunes can be lost, and even justice can be delayed. But the truth, once it takes root, has a stubborn, persistent, and beautiful way of clawing its way back into the sun. It is a force of nature more powerful than any dynasty, a silent promise that even after the longest night, the dawn will eventually and inevitably break.